Let's start. Every civilization that ever looked at the sea told the same story eventually. Something used to be there. A shelf of land, a bridge, a kingdom, a whole continent, and then the water took it. For most of history, that was treated as folklore, the kind of thing sailors said after too much wine, and for a long time, the experts were happy to leave it there. Myths don't need maps. They don't need soil samples. They don't need a bulldozer breaking through a roof, but the ground keeps talking anyway. Sonar keeps mapping the seafloor. Ice cores keep recording the centuries. Old charts keep turning up in archives nobody had opened in generations. And one by one, the myths have been forced to answer to the evidence. Some of them collapsed the second anyone looked closely. Others didn't collapse at all. They got a little more real every year, until the people who laughed at them the loudest had to quietly change the textbook. This is a countdown of 10 lost continents, 10 landmasses that were once treated as legend. And what happened when someone finally went looking for the ground beneath the story? A warning before we start. Not every entry on this list ends the same way. Some of these lands turn out to be exactly what the skeptics said: exaggeration, misreading, wishful thinking dressed up as history. Others turn out to be sitting under a few dozen meters of seawater right now, mapped, measured, and quietly accepted into geology textbooks within living memory. The point of this list isn't that every myth is secretly true. The point is that we haven't found it yet, and it never existed, are two very different sentences. And for a surprising number of these lost lands, mainstream science spent a long time confusing one for the other. Number 10, Doggerland, somewhere under the grey water of the southern North Sea, between what is now England and the Netherlands. There used to be a country nobody remembers voting for. Call it Doggerland. For thousands of years, it was ordinary dry ground, rivers, marshland, forests thick enough to get lost in, and people who hunted and fished across it like it was going to be there forever. Then the Ice Age ended, the ocean rose, and sometime around 6000 BC, the last of it slipped under the waves. No name survived it, no king list, no epic poem, just silence, and water, and a coastline that quietly moved. For most of modern history, that silence was treated as proof there was nothing to say. Doggerland wasn't in any history book because there was no history to put in one. It was just sea floor, the boring kind, sand and mud, where fish trawl and cargo ships pass overhead without a thought. If ancient people had lived there, the reasoning went, the sea would have erased every trace of them millennia ago. Case closed. Then the fishermen started pulling up bones. Since the early 20th century, North Sea trawlers dragging nets across the Dogger Bank kept snagging on things that weren't supposed to be there: mammoth teeth, antlers, the skulls of extinct animals, and eventually, tools. Actual worked flint, the unmistakable signature of human hands. Museums quietly filled drawers with dredged artifacts for decades before anyone treated the pattern as a message. The message was simple. People had lived down there. Lots of them. In 1931, a trawler called the Kalinda hauled up a lump of peat with something buried inside it: a barbed antler point, a hunting weapon, carbon dated to roughly 4000 BC. It had been sitting on what was once dry land that had since become 40 meters of open sea. That single object did what no argument could. It turned an empty patch of ocean into an archaeological site. Since then, the picture has only gotten bigger. Seismic surveys, originally run by oil companies mapping the seabed for drilling, were repurposed by archaeologists, and the scans revealed something staggering. Entire fossil river systems, valleys, and hill ranges preserved under the silt, the ghost outline of a lost landscape roughly the size of a small country. Researchers have reconstructed river networks, lake beds, even likely settlement sites, all invisible from the surface, all sitting exactly where the maps say a nation used to be. Nobody wrote Doggerland's obituary because nobody was left to write it. But the peat remembered the antler point. The seafloor remembered the rivers. And the trawlers, for 100 years, kept quietly dragging up the evidence before anyone thought to ask the question. More recently, researchers running the Europe's Lost Frontiers project took the seismic data further than anyone expected, extracting ancient sediment cores from the seabed and pulling DNA directly out of the mud, traces of plants, animals, and even human genetic material preserved in soil that hasn't seen open air in 8,000 years. The cores confirmed what the reconstructed rivers had already suggested: a landscape of oak forest, reed marsh, and grassland, rich enough to support a substantial population, right up until the final catastrophe. Because Doggerland's ending wasn't only a slow drowning. Around 6200 BC, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, now called the Storegga Slide, triggered a tsunami that swept across what remained of the low-lying plain, and whatever people were still living on the last exposed edges of the country would have had almost no warning at all. Doggerland didn't just sink beneath rising seas over millennia. Its final chapter arrived, by some estimates, in a matter of hours. Number 9, Beringia. For most of the 20th century, the story of how humans reached the Americas was treated as settled science, so settled it was taught to children as fact, with a single, tidy sentence. People walked across a land bridge from Siberia to Alaska. Simple, clean. A bridge, like a causeway. People crossing in a hurry to get to the other side. That land bridge had a name, Beringia, and for decades it was treated as exactly that. A narrow strip of exposed seabed, a hallway between two worlds, nothing more, except the timeline never quite worked. If people simply walked across a bridge and kept walking, archaeologists should have found their sites strung out neatly along the route, then radiating outward on a predictable schedule. Instead, genetic and archaeological evidence kept showing something stranger, a pause. A long one. Populations that looked isolated for thousands of years before spreading further into the Americas, as if an entire people had simply stopped somewhere and stayed put. Critics of the quick crossing model pointed out the obvious problem. A hallway isn't somewhere you live for millennia. Something didn't add up. Then the geologists looked at what Beringia actually was, and the bridge disappeared, replaced by something far bigger. At the height of the last ice age, when sea levels dropped more than 100 meters because so much of the world's water was locked in glaciers, the seabed between Siberia and Alaska didn't just poke above the waves as a strip. It rose into an entire landmass, 1,000 kilometers wide at its peak, roughly the size of the Yukon and Alaska combined. This wasn't a bridge. It was a subcontinent with its own tundra grasslands, its own rivers, its own herds of steppe bison and woolly mammoth, sheltered from the worst of the ice age, cold by the surrounding mountains and the ocean's moderating effect. That single correction solved the mystery that had bothered geneticists for years. The reason ancient populations show a long genetic pause before spreading into the Americas isn't a mistake in the data. It's because they weren't crossing a bridge in a hurry. They were living somewhere, a real place, a real homeland with its own ecosystem, for thousands of years before conditions finally allowed migration further east. Researchers now call it the Beringian standstill, and the standstill only makes sense once you accept that Beringia was never a hallway. It was a country, and people made a home in it, before the ocean reclaimed the ground beneath their feet. Pollen records pulled from sediment cores beneath the Bering Sea have only strengthened the case, showing patches of shrub tundra and even isolated stands of trees, enough vegetation to support the grazing animals, that in turn supported human hunters, in the middle of what modern textbooks used to describe as a frozen wasteland. Some researchers have gone further, proposing that pockets of Beringia may have functioned almost like a refuge, a relatively sheltered pocket of livable ground in an otherwise brutal Ice Age world. Exactly the kind of place a population could sit still in for a few thousand years without starving. The land bridge everyone learned about in school wasn't a hallway people rushed across. It was a homeland people were reluctant to leave, right up until the ocean made the decision for them. Number 8, Sundaland. Look at a map of Southeast Asia today, and you'll see an archipelago. Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines. Thousands of islands scattered across warm, shallow seas like the wreckage of something bigger. For a long time, that's exactly how mainstream science treated it. Wreckage. Separate islands that had always been separate, populated independently by waves of migration by boat. But indigenous oral traditions across the region kept describing something at odds with that picture. Ancestral homelands lost beneath the sea. Myths of great floods that swallowed whole kingdoms and left only the mountaintops as islands. For a long time, this was filed exactly where Doggerland's silence had been filed. Folklore, flood myth, nothing a serious geologist needed to take literally, The seafloor said otherwise. The waters separating Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula are shockingly shallow, in places barely 50 meters deep, a depth easily exposed by the same Ice Age sea level drop that created Beringia. When researchers mapped the ancient coastlines using bathymetric data, the result wasn't a scattering of separate islands. It was one enormous landmass, Sundaland, comparable in size to modern India, laced with major rivers that are now submerged channels on the seabed, supporting, by some estimates, a larger area of tropical lowland than exists anywhere in the region today. Genetic studies of Southeast Asian and Pacific populations have added a second layer of evidence entirely independent of the geology. Rather than showing the scattered, disconnected ancestries you'd expect from island populations that developed separately, the genetic record shows deep shared roots, consistent with a single, large, connected population that only fragmented into isolated island groups after the water rose and cut them off from each other. Some researchers have even proposed that Sundaland's flooding, a slow-motion catastrophe stretched over thousands of years as ice sheets melted, may be the geological seed behind flood myths that appear across the entire Southeast Asian and Pacific world, told and retold, long after anyone remembered the actual continent the water swallowed. The islands were never the whole story. They were what was left standing after the ocean took the rest. There's a further layer to this that makes Sundaland stand apart from almost everything else on this list. Some archaeologists and linguists studying the region have proposed that the loss of Sundaland wasn't just a geological event. It may have been a cultural catastrophe that reshaped the ancient world far beyond Southeast Asia. As the plain flooded in stages over several thousand years, the theory goes, waves of displaced people would have been pushed outward by the rising water again and again, carrying agricultural knowledge, boat-building skills, and language with them into India, China, and across the Pacific. It's a contested idea, and mainstream archaeology treats it as one hypothesis among several rather than settled fact. But the geological half of the claim, the sunken plain itself, the drowned rivers, the shallow seas that used to be dry ground, is no longer in dispute at all. The only real argument left is about what its loss set in Fusion. Number 7, Zealandia. Of everything on this list, this is the one modern geology now accepts without argument, and that acceptance came astonishingly late. For most of the 20th century, if you asked a geologist how many continents there are, you got the answer memorized in grade school. 7. A number so basic it felt less like a scientific finding, and more like a fact of nature, unchangeable, unchallengeable. New Zealand sat at the edge of that picture as an oddity nobody quite explained. A pair of mountainous islands rising abruptly out of deep ocean, geologically unlike the volcanic island chains around it, made of the wrong kind of rock for a simple seafloor formation. For decades, that oddity was treated as a curiosity, not a clue. Then oceanographic surveys began mapping the seafloor around New Zealand in detail, and the numbers stopped making sense as a curiosity. The crust beneath and around New Zealand wasn't oceanic crust, thin, dense, young. It was continental crust, thick, buoyant, ancient, chemically identical to the material that makes up Australia or South America. And it didn't stop at the coastline. It extended outward for millions of square kilometers in every direction, an entire buried landmass, roughly the size of India, with New Zealand and New Caledonia as the only part still standing above the waves. In 2017, a team of geologists made the case formally, publishing research arguing that this landmass meets every geological criterion required to be called a continent in its own right: elevated crust, distinct geology, clearly defined boundaries, an area large enough to qualify. They gave it a name, Zealandia, and estimated that 94% of it sits underwater, submerged roughly 23 million years ago as the crust stretched, thinned, and sank beneath the Pacific. It took over a century of survey data, satellite gravity mapping, and rock sampling from research vessels for the world's scientific institutions to formally recognize an eighth continent, one that had been sitting there the entire time, mostly invisible, waiting for someone to add up the numbers. The 7-continent model wasn't wrong because anyone lied. It was wrong because nobody had gone looking underwater. In 2021, an international research team went even further, publishing the first complete geological map of Zealandia's seafloor, built from thousands of rock and sediment samples, dredged up over decades of ocean voyages. The map confirmed the continent's full outline for the first time, roughly 5 million square kilometers, and revealed something researchers hadn't expected: evidence that parts of Zealandia may briefly have poked above sea level around 25 million years ago before sinking back down. A continent that surfaced, took a breath, and slipped under again. It is, geologists now openly say, the thinnest, most submerged, and most recently identified continent on Earth. And the strangest part of the story might be how ordinary its discovery actually was. No lost civilization, no ancient prophecy. Just decades of unglamorous rock sampling until enough data points finally forced the map to be redrawn. Number 6. The sunken structures of Yonaguni. In 1986, a diver exploring the waters off the coast of Yonaguni, the westernmost island of Japan, swam over something that shouldn't have been there. A massive rectangular formation on the seafloor, roughly 25 meters below the surface, with flat terraces, sharp right-angle edges, and what looked unmistakably like carved steps. The claim that followed was electric. Some researchers argued this was the remains of a man-made structure, a temple or ceremonial platform, built on dry land during the last ice age when sea levels were far lower, and drowned when the water rose roughly 10,000 years ago. If true, it would be one of the oldest constructed monuments on Earth, older than the pyramids by thousands of years, built by a civilization mainstream archaeology had no record of at all. Proponents pointed to what they described as smaller carved features nearby, shapes some interpreted as animal reliefs or symbols, and argued no natural process could produce such consistent geometry. Mainstream geologists pushed back hard, and their case wasn't weak. Sandstone in that part of the Pacific naturally fractures along flat bedding planes and right-angle joints, the same forces that produce the famously stepped, blocky rock formations found on land nearby, above water, where nobody disputes they're natural. Skeptics argued the monument was simply a well-known geological process, tectonic stress fracturing layered rock into shapes that look engineered purely by coincidence of mineral structure. The debate has never fully resolved, and that's the honest answer. Some marine geologists maintain the formation is entirely natural. Some archaeologists who have dived the site insist certain features, sharp corners meeting at angles unlikely from fracturing alone, apparent post holes, a formation some divers describe as resembling a stairway too regular to be accidental, deserve more serious excavation than they've received. What both sides agree on is simpler and just as remarkable. Sea levels in that region really were roughly 40 meters lower during the last ice age, meaning whatever sits on that seafloor today, natural rock formation or ancient structure, was unquestionably dry land once, walkable ground that a person could have stood on long before the Pacific closed back over it. Number 5. Kumari Kandam. In Tamil literary tradition, there's a memory older than most nations. A lost continent called Kumari Kandam, a vast southern landmass, home to an advanced civilization, seat of ancient Tamil academies of poetry and learning, that was swallowed by a catastrophic series of floods thousands of years ago, leaving behind only the southern tip of India and the island of Sri Lanka as what remained. For colonial-era scholars, this was filed exactly where every other flood myth got filed: poetic invention, a Tamil answer to Atlantis, meant to give a proud culture an ancient homeland grander than the archaeological record could support. And it's fair to say the more extreme claims made about Kumari Kandam, entire university systems, advanced technology, a golden age society, thousands of years before any confirmed Southeast Asian civilization, remain unsupported by any physical evidence discovered so far. That much is not in serious dispute. But the geology underneath the legend is not nothing. The Gulf of Mannar and the shallow channel separating India and Sri Lanka, known as Adam's Bridge, sit on a continental shelf that was demonstrably above water during the last ice age, when global sea levels sat more than 100 meters lower than today. Marine surveys have confirmed a submerged landmass south of modern India that would have been dry, walkable ground within the time frame of early human habitation of the subcontinent. A real, drowned coastal plain, not a fantasy. Some researchers studying the region's post-glacial flooding have proposed that the repeated dramatic sea level rises at the end of the last ice age, and the very real flooding events that followed could plausibly be the geological kernel around which the Kumari Kandam tradition grew over thousands of years of retelling. The lesson here cuts both ways, and it's worth sitting with. The most elaborate claims about a lost Tamil superpower remain unproven and likely always will be, but the land itself, the ground the legend insists used to be there, genuinely was there, genuinely was habitable, and genuinely did go under the waves. Sometimes a myth exaggerates a real coastline into an empire. That doesn't make the coastline any less real. Aiding to the intrigue, marine archaeologists surveying the Gulf of Kambat off the coast of Gujarat, well north of the traditional Kumari Kandam region, but on the same drowned Indian coastline, reported sonar readings in 2001 that appeared to show geometric, grid-like structures on the seabed at a depth consistent with the same ice age sea level drop. The claim was picked up eagerly by outlets looking for a real-world Atlantis story, but the scientific response was far more cautious. Marine geologists who reviewed the sonar data pointed out that the Gulf of Kambat has extremely strong tidal currents capable of carving natural geometric patterns into sediment, and that no artifact recovered from the site has been conclusively dated or confirmed as man-made by peer-reviewed analysis. The site remains formally unresolved, neither confirmed as a submerged settlement nor definitively ruled out. Exactly the kind of unfinished evidence that keeps a legend like Kumari Kandam alive a little longer. Number 4. Lemuria. Unlike almost everything else on this list, Lemuria wasn't born from folklore. It was born from a scientific paper. In 1864, a British zoologist named Philip Sclater was staring at a genuine puzzle, lemurs, found only in Madagascar and pockets of India and Southeast Asia, nowhere in between, nowhere on the African mainland separating them. Continental drift hadn't been proposed yet, so Sclater reached for the explanation available to him: a lost landmass, a sunken continent once connecting Madagascar to India that had allowed lemurs and related species to spread across a single, unbroken habitat before the land vanished beneath the Indian Ocean. He called it Lemuria, and for a while, actual scientists took the idea seriously as a working hypothesis to explain a real biological distribution pattern that genuinely needed explaining. Then, decades later, occultist writers found Sclater's respectable scientific hypothesis and ran, transforming a proposed land bridge into a lost psychic civilization, home to an advanced spiritual super race, later blended with theories about Atlantis and Mu, into an entire alternative history with no connection to Sclater's original, comparatively modest zoological argument. Here's the twist mainstream science eventually delivered, and it's a strange one. Sclater was right that something explained the lemur puzzle. He was simply working before plate tectonics existed as a concept. Once geologists confirmed that landmasses genuinely do drift, and that Madagascar, India, and Africa were once joined together as part of the supercontinent Gondwana before splitting apart and drifting to their current positions over tens of millions of years, the lemur distribution stopped needing a sunken continent at all. It was explained by continents that moved, not one that sank. So Lemuria isn't a lost landmass science refuses to admit existed. It's the opposite. A real scientific puzzle that got the right general instinct. Something used to connect these lands, wrapped around the wrong mechanism, and then hijacked by mystics who threw out the science and kept only the drama. The land bridge never existed. The connection absolutely did. It just moved on legs of solid rock, not water. Number 3. Mu. If Lemuria began as a real scientist's honest mistake, Mu began as something considerably less innocent. In the early 20th century, a British-American writer named James Churchward began publishing a series of books claiming the existence of a vast Pacific continent called Mu, home to an advanced civilization of 64 million people, mother culture to Egypt, India, and the Maya alike, destroyed 12,000 years ago in a cataclysm that sank it beneath the Pacific Ocean overnight. Churchward claimed his source was extraordinary, a set of ancient tablets shown to him decades earlier by a Hindu priest in India, written in a lost language called Nakal, that he said only he and the priest could read. For a segment of the public hungry for a grand unifying explanation behind ancient monuments around the world, Mu was irresistible. Churchward's books sold well, and Mu entered popular culture as a rival to Atlantis. its own lost super-civilization, complete with maps, alphabets, and elaborate migration charts, showing its refugees seeding every ancient culture on Earth. Then researchers actually went looking for Churchward's evidence, and it evaporated on contact. No knock-all tablets have ever been produced, verified, or independently examined by any scholar besides Churchward himself. No Hindu priest matching his account has ever been identified. Linguists who examined Churchward's claimed translations found them to bear no relationship to any known writing system, ancient or otherwise. When skeptical researchers cross-checked his supposed evidence from Mesoamerica, they found Churchward had badly misread illustrations in an actual well-documented Maya codex, the Troano Codex, seeing a lost continent's destruction in pages that specialists in Maya writing had already identified as depicting entirely different, mundane content. There is, to this day, no geological evidence anywhere in the Pacific Ocean of a sunken continental landmass matching Mu's supposed size or timeline. The Pacific seafloor has been mapped extensively, and it shows exactly what plate tectonics predicts: oceanic crust, not the drowned remains of a continent. Mu belongs on this list for the opposite reason everything else does. It's the clearest case where science looked hard, checked the sources, and the lost continent simply wasn't there. Not because of a conspiracy of silence, but because the evidence for it was fabricated from the start. Sometimes the ground really does have nothing to say. That's a legitimate finding too. Number 2, Atlantis. No lost continent has a more famous origin story, and it comes from exactly one source. Around 360 BC, the Greek philosopher Plato described, in 2 dialogues, a magnificent island civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules, technologically and militarily dominant, that grew arrogant, angered the gods, and was swallowed by the sea in a single day and night 9,000 years before his own time. For centuries, the debate over Atlantis has run in a predictable groove. Skeptics point out correctly that no other ancient source, not one, corroborates Plato's account, that Plato explicitly used the story to illustrate a moral philosophical point about hubris and the ideal state, and that the timeline he gives, 9,000 years before a 4th century BC philosopher, would place an advanced seafaring civilization thousands of years before agriculture itself existed anywhere on Earth. Taken literally, the story simply cannot be true as written. Most classicists conclude, reasonably, that Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical device, the same way he invented other allegories, and never intended anyone to go dig for it. But archaeology has produced one genuine, physical candidate for what might have inspired the story, and it's a serious one. Around 1600 BC, the volcanic island of Thera, now called Santorini, in the Aegean Sea, erupted in one of the most powerful volcanic events of the ancient world. An explosion so violent it blew out the center of the island entirely, leaving the crescent-shaped caldera that still exists today. Excavations at the site of Akrotiri on Santorini, buried and preserved under volcanic ash much like Pompeii, have revealed an entire sophisticated Bronze Age Minoan city, multi-story buildings, indoor plumbing, elaborate frescoes, a genuinely advanced maritime civilization wiped out in a catastrophe within a single human lifetime. Many archaeologists and classicists have proposed that garbled folk memory of Thera's eruption and the collapse of Minoan civilization that followed it filtered down through centuries of Egyptian and Greek retelling before reaching Plato, could plausibly be the real historical kernel he wrapped into his philosophical fable, with numbers and dates inflated or mistranslated along the way. Nobody has found the literal island Plato described sitting on any seafloor, and the honest scientific position is that they likely never will, because it likely never existed exactly as written. But something real did vanish beneath the Aegean in a single, sudden, terrifying event, a genuine advanced civilization, buried and drowned in the very region the legend came from. Plato may have invented Atlantis. He may not have invented the memory underneath it. There's one more detail that keeps the Thera theory alive among serious researchers, rather than dismissed alongside the wilder Atlantis claims. Egyptian records from the era describe strange atmospheric disturbances, darkened skies, and unusual weather patterns around the time of the Thera eruption, consistent with the kind of ash cloud a volcanic explosion of that scale would have produced across the eastern Mediterranean. Ice cores from Greenland and tree ring records from as far away as North America, both show a sharp climate signal dated to roughly the same period, physical proof that whatever happened at Thera was large enough to leave a mark on the entire planet's atmosphere, not just on one drowned Minoan city. An event that size, remembered imperfectly, translated between languages, and retold for 1,000 years before Plato ever picked up a stylus, is exactly the kind of raw material real legends are built from. Number 1. The ice-free coastline of Antarctica. In 1929, in the Topkapi Palace Library in Istanbul, a German theologian found a fragment of an old Ottoman map drawn in 1513 by an admiral named Piri Reis, compiled by his own written notes from a collection of far older source charts, some allegedly dating back to the era of Alexander the Great. The map showed the coasts of Europe, Africa, and South America in startling accuracy for its time, and then, along the bottom edge, a stretch of coastline that decades later, in the 1950s, a U.S. Air Force officer named Harold Ohlmeyer claimed matched the coastal outline of Antarctica's Queen Maud Land, a landmass not officially discovered until 1820, and not comprehensively mapped until the 20th century used seismic surveys to see beneath its ice. The claim that followed became one of the most famous in all of alternative history. If accurate, it would mean the source charts Piri Reis copied from were drawn by someone who had mapped Antarctica's coastline while it was still free of ice, a condition scientists believe existed roughly 6,000 years ago at the latest, implying either an advanced seafaring civilization lost to history or evidence some fringe researchers link to a broader lost civilization reshaping of the ancient world. Mainstream cartographic historians who have studied the actual Piri Reis map in detail push back firmly, and their case deserves to be heard in full. The map itself, in Piri Reis's own accompanying notes, is explicitly a composite of contemporary and near-contemporary 16th century sources, including charts reportedly used by Columbus himself, not ancient originals. Several cartographic historians who have closely examined the southern coastline in question argue it simply represents the coast of South America, curving eastward and distorted by the errors typical of early 16th century mapmaking projections, rather than a separate Antarctic landmass at all. The map's own scale and compass roses, when analyzed rigorously, are consistent with known errors sailors of that era regularly made extending coastlines they hadn't fully charted, not with a lost source map of unknown antiquity. That is the honest state of the debate, and it hasn't fully closed on either side. What is not disputed, because ice core and marine sediment records confirm it directly, is that Antarctica has not always looked the way it looks now. Geological evidence shows the continent was largely ice-free for long stretches of its deep history, and sediment cores have even revealed fossilized root systems and pollen consistent with temperate forest, proof the land beneath the ice sheet once supported life under open sky. Whether any human civilization ever charted that coastline before the ice returned is a question the evidence available today cannot answer either way. But the coastline existing at some point without its ice is not folklore. It's geology, sitting quietly under kilometers of frozen water, waiting, like everything else on this list, for someone to go looking properly. What makes this final entry different from a simple debunking is what came after the argument over the map itself. In the decades since the Piri Reis controversy exploded into popular culture, actual radar and seismic surveys of Antarctica, conducted by teams using ice-penetrating instruments, dragged behind research aircraft and traverse vehicles, have built up a detailed picture of the bedrock hidden beneath the ice sheet, mountain ranges, valleys, and yes, coastlines, none of which resemble the shape on the old Ottoman chart, but all of which confirm the deeper truth the map's defenders were reaching for. Antarctica is not simply a featureless disk of ice. It's a continent with real topography, real geological history, and real evidence of a warmer, greener past, locked away under the thickest ice on the planet and only now being read, one radar pass at a time, 10 lost lands. Some of them turned out to be real continents, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to run the survey. Some turned out to be genuine coastlines, wrapped in centuries of exaggerated legend. And at least one turned out to be nothing but a confident man and a codex he never actually read correctly. The ocean doesn't lie, but it doesn't explain itself either. Every one of these stories started the same way, with someone refusing to accept that nobody has looked yet was the same thing as nothing is there.